Welcome back, deep divers. Today, we're going deep, way back into the Cold War. We're talking about, well, actually, let's be more specific. We're diving into a document about the inner workings of the KGB.
The KGB, yes, that infamous Russian secret police.
Exactly.
The document we'll be looking at is titled The KGB, Russian Secret Police, Its Composition, Aims, and Methods.
Catchy. So before we get too far into this, what are we hoping to learn from this deep dive?
Well, this document, it's a bit of a dense read, I have to say, but it's packed with insights into what made the KGB such a formidable force. I mean, they weren't just some security organization.
Right, right. They were much more than that.
Yeah, they were the iron fist of the Communist Party, the enforcers.
And this document really emphasizes that, doesn't it? It makes it clear that the KGB answered only to the highest levels of the party.
Absolutely, the top brass. And that meant they could, get this, actually overrule other powerful figures, like even in the military, or the regular police.
Wow, talk about power.
Right. And to maintain that level of control and secrecy, they basically operated in a world of their own.
The document, it even describes, like, the KGB having its own schools and shops, even like agricultural centers.
Exactly. They minimized contact with the outside world as much as possible, keeping everything in-house.
It's pretty wild to imagine growing up in that kind of closed-off system.
It's almost like a state within a state, incredibly isolating, I'd imagine. But I guess that isolation bred a certain kind of loyalty and dedication, right?
And ruthlessness, maybe.
Oh, most definitely, especially when you consider some of the tasks they were responsible for.
Well, let's get into that then. The document provides a pretty detailed breakdown of the KGB structure, starting with Chief Directorate Number 1, which handled all their foreign intelligence operations.
Yes, Chief Directorate Number 1, the spies. And within that directorate, you had these various sections, each specializing in a different area.
Okay, so give me some examples.
Well, one that always fascinates me is Section S. They were responsible for the sleepers.
The sleepers?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Those deep cover agents. Planted in the West, sometimes for years, right? Living these totally ordinary lives until, boom, they're activated.
Precisely. The document actually mentions some pretty famous examples, like Yuri Lejanov. He was caught in South Africa. And then there's Rudolph Abel. He was a big one. And, Gordon Lonsdale. He lived as this seemingly normal British businessman for years.
It's incredible, the discipline they must have had to keep up that double life for so long. Talk about a stressful job.
No kidding, always looking over your shoulder. But sleepers were just one part of it. There was also Section T. They were focused on getting their hands on valuable Western technology.
Stealing secrets, basically, to get ahead in the tech race. Makes you wonder what specific technologies they were after, and how successful they actually were.
Great questions. And then you have Section I. These were the analysts, the brains of the operation. They sifted through all the intelligence gathered by the other sections, tried to make sense of it all.
I guess their work was pretty crucial, huh? I mean, connecting the dots, anticipating their enemies' moves.
Absolutely vital. Then there was Section K, all about counterintelligence. They kept tabs on Soviet citizens abroad, made sure no one was stepping out of line.
So even outside their borders, they were watching. Chilling.
It is, isn't it? Big Brother's always watching, as they say.
And then there was the most, sinister sounding of all.
Section KR.
Yeah?
Yes, Section KR. Disinformation, sabotage, even assassinations.
Wow. They weren't just gathering information. They were actively destabilizing their enemies and eliminating threats.
It was a multifaceted operation, that's for sure. But while Chief Directorate No. 1 had their eyes on the outside world, Chief Directorate No. 2, well, they focused on keeping things in check right there in the USSR.
Right, internal security, keeping the Soviet citizens in line.
Exactly. The document describes them, let's just say they played a key role in suppressing any uprising.
Uprisings, like what kind of uprising?
Well, food shortages were a big one. Remember, there was a lot of discontent simmering beneath the surface in the Soviet Union. And sometimes, it boiled over.
And the KGB was there to crack down.
You got it. The document doesn't sugarcoat their methods either. For instance, for something like, let's say, stealing food or just criticizing the government, you could be accused of economic sabotage.
Economic sabotage?
Yeah, and that could actually get you a death sentence by firing squad.
No way. That's intense.
It was a very different time, to say the least.
So much for freedom of speech, huh? It's clear that the KGB had a really, really tight grip on the population.
Oh, absolutely. And it wasn't just Chief Director at No. 2 involved in this. There was also Chief Director at Number 5. They oversaw the Gulag labor camps.
The gulags. Those are infamous.
Rightfully so. Writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn have really brought the horrors of those camps to light. People sent there for simply speaking out against the government.
It's a dark chapter in history, for sure.
It is. And it gets even more disturbing when you consider that the KGB also used psychiatric institutions to silence dissidents.
Wait, what? Like they would declare people mentally ill just because they disagreed with the government?
They'd label them as insane and lock them away. The document actually uses Marshal Grigorenko as an example. He was a war hero, decorated, who criticized the government.
And they declared him insane.
Exactly.
Wow, it's really chilling.
It was a very effective way to silence opposition. Anyone could be deemed an enemy of the state and disappear, and it created this atmosphere of fear, you know? You never knew who might be next.
So the KGB was controlling information coming from abroad, clamping down on dissent at home, and they were even using psychiatric hospitals as a tool of oppression. But it wasn't just about brute force, was it? They also had this whole, sophisticated propaganda machine.
Oh, absolutely. The document makes it clear that shaping perceptions, both within the Soviet Union and internationally, was a core part of their strategy. And they had specific departments dedicated to this.
So tell me about this propaganda machine. How did they go about influencing public opinion?
Well, there were two key players, according to the document. First, you had the International Department. They were part of the Communist Party itself.
Okay, so within the party.
Right. They were known as 10. And this department, their goal was to basically export revolution abroad. They worked closely with groups like the South African Communist Party and the ANC.
So they were actively fueling these revolutionary movements.
Exactly. But then you also had the International Information Department, or 110, and they were all about crafting propaganda aimed at audiences outside the USSR.
Oh, interesting. So one department is focused on actually inciting revolution on the ground, and the other is trying to shape global opinion.
You got it. Two sides of the same coin, I guess you could say. And what's fascinating is the document actually highlights this contradiction. While 10 was pushing for global revolution, when 10 was often putting out messages that totally contradicted the reality of life inside the USSR.
So they were selling a rosy picture of communism to the outside world, but internally, they were crushing any opposition.
That seems to be the case. It's classic doublespeak.
It's amazing how they could manipulate the truth so effectively.
And their tactics went even further. They also had this vast network of front organizations, seemingly innocent groups, but actually tools of the KGB.
Give me some examples. What kind of front organizations?
Well, the document names several, like the World Peace Council, the World Federation of Trade Unions, and the World Federation of Democratic Youth.
Wow, those all sound, well, pretty harmless.
Exactly, that was the point. They could operate under the radar, exerting influence and spreading their propaganda without raising too many eyebrows.
It's pretty sneaky,
Yeah.
Making people think they're supporting a good cause when in reality they're just advancing the agenda of a foreign power.
Very Machiavellian, wouldn't you say?
Totally. And it gets even more disturbing. The document also claims that the KGB managed to even infiltrate organizations like UNESCO and the World Council of Churches.
Yes, even those seemingly neutral groups weren't immune. It makes you wonder just how far their reach extended.
It does. So we've covered their structure, their iron grip on internal control, and their incredibly sophisticated propaganda machine. But I feel like we've only scratched the surface. The document also delves into their mastery of disinformation.
Ah, yes, disinformation. That's where things get really interesting and, frankly, a bit scary, because they were masters at blending truth, half-truths, and outright lies.
That sounds like a nightmare to try and counter. I mean, how do you even fight back against something that's designed to sow doubt and confusion?
It was, and still is, a very effective strategy. It muddies the waters, makes it hard to discern fact from fiction, and even when you debunk a piece of disinformation, those seeds of doubt often linger.
It's like today, with fake news and all the misinformation flying around online.
Exactly. You see how those tactics, those KGB tactics, have evolved and adapted to the digital age. It's something we're going to explore in much more detail in part 2 of our deep dive.
Can't wait. I have a feeling we're just getting started. We're talking about the KGB's disinformation tactics and how relevant they feel even today. with all the fake news and misinformation we see online.
Yeah, it's like their playbook is still being used, just on a much larger scale. I mean, the methods have changed, sure, but that underlying goal to manipulate and control through information, that's still very much in play.
It's almost like we're living in a world where everyone's got a megaphone, right? Everyone's shouting their own version of the truth.
And that makes it so hard to filter through it all, doesn't it? Figure out what's real, what's not.
Yeah, it can be totally overwhelming.
And that's exactly what makes disinformation so effective. It thrives in that chaos, in that confusion. It plays on our doubts, our fears, our tendency to believe things that confirm what we already think.
So what do we do? How do we fight back?
Well, one crucial takeaway from all this, from studying how the KGB operated, is the importance of critical thinking. We can't just passively absorb information anymore.
Right. We can't just take things at face value.
Exactly. We need to be questioning everything, looking for evidence, being wary of sources that seem, overly biased or sensationalized.
So we need to be more active, more engaged with the information we consume, not just passively scrolling and clicking.
Exactly. We have to be active participants, not just passive consumers.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. But sometimes it feels like it's not just about the information itself, It's about how our own minds can distort things. Like we see what we want to see, believe what we want to believe.
Oh, you're absolutely right. We have to be aware of our own biases and how those biases can be exploited. And the KGB, they were masters at this, at playing on people's emotions, their fears, their prejudices.
So in a way, it's a two-pronged approach. We have to be skeptical of the information itself, but also be aware of how we're filtering that information.
That's a great way to put it. We have to be constantly asking ourselves, why am I believing this? What evidence supports this? Am I letting my emotions cloud my judgment?
Those are good questions.
Yeah.
So are there any other lessons we can learn from the KGB, from their approach? Like what about their use of front organizations? Is that still something we see today?
Oh, absolutely. It's even more prevalent now with globalization and everything. Think about all the NGOs, think tanks, advocacy groups out there. Now, a lot of them are totally legitimate, doing important work.
Right, but some are not.
Well, some might be used, knowingly or unknowingly to advance someone else's agenda, maybe even a foreign power.
So how do we tell the difference? How can we be sure an organization is legit?
Due diligence. You have to do your research. Look into their funding, their leadership, their track record.
Oh, transparency is key.
Absolutely. If an organization is being cagey about where their money comes from or what they're actually doing, that's a huge red flag.
Follow the money, right?
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask questions. A legitimate organization will be open about their operations and their goals.
This is a lot, It's complex. It's like we're living in a world where truth is constantly under attack, where there's manipulation and deception everywhere.
It can feel that way sometimes, can it?
It can. So how do we navigate all this without becoming completely paranoid?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Finding that balance between healthy skepticism and still believing in, genuine connection, authentic communication.
Right. So we don't want to become too cynical.
Exactly. It's an ongoing battle. We have to be vigilant, but we can't let that vigilance turn into, a complete distrust of everything and everyone.
It's like walking a tightrope. But it sounds like understanding these tactics, the tactics of organizations like the KGB, can help us be more discerning, more resilient.
Absolutely. By learning from the past, we can equip ourselves for the challenges of the present and the future.
Okay, so we've talked about the darker side of the KGB, their methods of control, their propaganda, their mastery of disinformation. But is there anything positive or maybe just insightful that we can take away from studying them? Were they always the bad guys? Or is there, a more nuanced perspective?
That's an interesting question, and I think it's worth exploring. I mean, we can't condone their actions, obviously, but there's a level of strategic thinking, a level of, well, let's call it brilliance, that we can't ignore. They were masters at understanding their adversaries, at playing the long game.
So even if their methods were, well, morally reprehensible, we can still learn from their strategic approach.
Yes. It's like, think of it like studying a chess grandmaster. Even if you don't agree with their style of play, you can still appreciate their skill and learn from their moves.
Okay, that makes sense.
For example, their understanding of human psychology was really profound. They knew how to push people's buttons, how to exploit their emotions and biases, and they used that knowledge to manipulate and control.
So in a way, they were ahead of their time in their grasp of behavioral science and how it could be used to influence people.
In many ways, yes. And while, again, we shouldn't condone their methods, understanding those methods can help us recognize when they're being used against us, even in more subtle, less obvious ways.
It's like if you know the signs of a con artist, you're less likely to fall for their tricks.
Precisely. It's about developing that awareness, that, let's call it psychological immunity.
I like that, psychological immunity. So by studying the KGB, we can actually become more resilient to manipulation, more empowered.
Exactly. We can learn to recognize the patterns, the tactics, the subtle cues that signal someone's trying to mess with our heads. And armed with that knowledge, we can make more informed decisions. We can resist those attempts to control us.
That's a much more positive way to think about it. Instead of feeling like victims, we can become more active, more discerning.
That's the goal. And that's a valuable lesson to learn, no matter where it comes from, even from an organization as, well, controversial as the KGB.
We've explored a lot. Their structure, their methods of control and propaganda, how those tactics have evolved and are still relevant today. We've talked about being critical thinkers, being aware of our biases, and how information, both true and false, can be used as a weapon. But I have a feeling there's still more to unpack. What other insights can we glean from this deep dive? And what lessons can we apply to our own lives? That's where we'll pick things up in the final part of our deep dive into the world of the KGB. So we've spent a lot of time with the KGB now, their tactics, their legacy, all of that. And it's heavy stuff.
Yeah, no doubt. It's a lot to process.
For sure. But, I'm thinking we've mostly focused on like the risks, the manipulation, the disinformation, all the bad stuff. But I'm wondering, is there a more hopeful side to this?
There is. I mean, think about it. The KGB, they thrived in secrecy, right? Total control of information. They were terrified of the truth.
Why?
Because they knew deep down that an informed population, people who thought for themselves, that was their biggest threat.
Oh, I see. So you're saying the best defense against those tactics is to create a society where truth can actually thrive.
Exactly. A society that values critical thinking, open dialogue, the free exchange of ideas. That's where manipulation and all that. It just has a much harder time taking root.
Makes sense. It's like shining a light into the shadows, right?
Yeah.
The KGB and all those who use those same tactics, they operate best in the dark.
Exactly. So it's not just about, defending against the bad. It's about actively promoting the good, being critical consumers of information, yeah, but also being producers of truth.
So engaging in those discussions, challenging assumptions, being willing to, change our minds when we see new evidence.
Yes, all of that. It takes humility.
Recognizing that none of us have all the answers.
And that's the complete opposite of the KGB worldview, They were all about control.
Two totally different approaches, like the KGB trying to restrict information, control the narrative, and then this idea of an open society where truth actually comes from, the free exchange of ideas.
And in the end, I truly believe truth has a power that all the propaganda and disinformation in the world can't extinguish.
That's a powerful thought. And it's a hopeful one.
It is. But we can't just wait for it to happen, We have to participate, seek out the truth, defend it, share it with others.
So we have a responsibility to protect the truth.
We do. Individually, but also collectively.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive, to say the least. It's definitely given us a lot to think about.
It has.
And it's left me feeling, I don't know, both cautious and hopeful. Cautious because, the threat of manipulation, it's real.
It is, no doubt.
But also hopeful because I think if we understand the threats and we embrace the truth, well, maybe, just maybe, we can build a better world, a more informed world, a more resilient world.
And a freer world.
A freer world. I like that a lot. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time.